great pleasure in speaking to Marianne Chidiac, who earlier this year brought out her book, Relational Organisational Gestalt, which I've got here. Marianne, welcome. It's very good to speak to you.
Thank you, Jim. It's always good to speak to you too. Thank you. My
first impression of the book was of the cover, which has a very interesting sort of symbolic evolutionary design on it. Could you say a little bit about the picture on the cover of the book?
Sure. Well, I'm glad it caught your attention, actually, Jim, because I drew up with the help of an artist friend, Zohana Sif, and it is, you know, many people will recognize it as having been inspired by the Dutch artist Escher, who also drew fish and birds. And in a way, I just love the idea for this book because it symbolized first, I guess, change and transformation, and also captured a bit of the metaphor of the sea, which plays quite a central role in the wave analogy, which I describe in the book. So, you know, it does this, and it also plays with the notion of figure ground, which is quite central to Gestalt. So there's lots of reasons why I just loved it, and the fact that I could draw it and put it on the book was lovely. But what I noticed, just sort of thinking about Escher, is that what I managed to do in this front cover is, unlike Escher's drawing, who replicate the same fish or bird in a symmetrical kind of pattern, because that's how Escher worked. I think what's different about this one is that, if you notice, every fish is unique and different in shape or size. And somehow it felt appropriate, you know, just recognizing the phenomenology, the unique phenomenological experiences that we each have as individuals. So I'm glad it caught your attention.
Who did you have in mind when you sort of started writing the book? Who is the book really written for?
Well, primarily, I guess it's anyone who works in organization and has an interest in how to better manage the personal or intersubjective dimensions of change. As you know, Sally Denham-Vaughan and myself have been developing, writing and teaching about relational organizational gestalt, or ROG, for many years. And we usually work with a small cohort of people in our trainings and have practitioners which range from senior managers in organizations to OD practitioners to individual team coaches and facilitators. So it's really for that group of people.
The book is full of models and concepts. It's actually packed with sort of new ideas and concepts. But if you were going to condense it down to a few bullet points, what would you say, what would you like people to take away as the take-home message of the book?
Yes, well, you're right in saying that there's a lot of models and theories, as you know, in a way it's come about because we tried to put in one book also kind of a textbooks of what we were teaching our cohorts. But if I were to summarize the essential message, for me it will be kind of twofold. One is that working with emergence is at the heart of how we can resolve complex issues in organizations. And the second point would be that Gestalt, as a relational approach, offers a practical way of bringing about and working with emergence. So if I expanded on that just a tiny bit, would be, you know, what the book reacts against in some way is the rigidity of the planning paradigm, which is still very prevalent in organizations. So most leaders, for example, are still taught that good leadership is primarily about command and control, and that implementing change, so getting from point A to point B, is all about having a planned out sort of approach and sticking to that plan. But we know, you know, all of us that have actually managed any projects, we know that it's much more common, especially for complex problems, that to have several planning stages or replanning stages along the way from point A to point B, and that eventually point B is very different from the original point envisaged or looked at. So the planned paradigm, although it's helpful in terms of initial preparation and organizing, it needs to be reconsidered, you know, to recognize that even a planned approach is actually emergent, particularly when dealing with people. And so creating conditions for that emergence is what leads to a more efficient, novel, and sustainable solution.
Right, yes. You slightly preempted my next question, which was, which was, I know you have a strong scientific background, that you trained originally as an engineer.
Yes.
And yet you come out quite strongly against that sort of reductionist scientific, particularly sort of Taylor-esque scientific management.
Yes.
But I wondered how a relational approach, you've said a little bit already, sort of emergent,
Yeah.
but how a relational approach differs from the vast majority of books that are out there on organizational development.
Yes, and there are many. I mean, yes, you're right that my first degree was in engineering, electronics engineering. And in a way, I wouldn't say that I'm critical of science, but really view it that it's only one valid paradigm from which we can operate efficiently or effectively. So a scientific approach deconstructs usually to understand or make meaning. And when you do that, when you do go for a deconstruction, it usually loses sight of the whole. So I feel that a scientific approach is at best when the number of variables that are under consideration are limited. But when we're dealing with human beings or change with human beings, I think that's quite impossible. And so this type of reductionist approach often I feel leads to an oversimplification. So you mentioned Taylorism, which is the scientific management, which is the application of engineering principles, isn't it, to management. And in that approach, in the Taylor's approach, most of the time human beings were looked at just cogs in a machine, really, an adjunct to machines. So, in the past, at the time of Taylor, where I think organizational change meant mostly streamlining operational processes through scientific management principles, and assuming mostly that there was only one way for this operational efficiency to come about, and all employees needed to strictly follow this way. Unfortunately, I think that probably there's some remnants of Taylorisms that is still available in a lot of management thinking today. Even though most organizations have moved away from like blue collar workforce driven economy to a knowledge-based economy. So really, I think it's time to change this sort of management thinking and to recognize that organizational change today requires something a bit more real, which takes account of the messiness of human change. And the fact that we can be rational as well as emotional and more human rather than machine-like. Yeah. So I mean, I guess that is my position rather than being anti-science. It's more about it's just not enough, and that's why I realized, coming from an engineering background, that actually I needed something more than that scientific approach. So. I mean, in the other part of your question, it was, what is a relational approach in contrast? And I guess a relational approach, rather than reduce issues to a handful of variables and have this reductionist approach, emphasizes the interconnectedness of everything. It's the complexity of everything, so that we can't truly understand an organization, an abstraction of the people or a process, without looking at the overall context or culture. So, often many businesses still assume they can outsource their back office functionality or their HR function without having any impact at all on the organization as a whole. And so this, for me, disregards, the human factor in the way the organization functions. So I think in that sense, it's different. And I can say a bit more about why it's different from other OD books, if that's of interest.
Thank you. So who have been your major sort of philosophical influences, and what are your favorite ideas that you've taken from them?
Yeah, well, as you know, Jim, because you and I have talked about philosophy quite a bit, so I think Gestalt is steeped in philosophical influences, primarily would be an existential and phenomenological practice. You know, it is, and it's inspired from a number of those ideas. So from an existential point of view, it will be the existentialism of people like Kierkegaard rather than Sartre. And, you know, it's an approach that rejects nihilism and really emphasizes personal responsibility. So that's one thing that I think is central to Gestalt. As you know, in terms of phenomenology, it comes from the school of European phenomenological sort of thinkers. So people like Brentano, Husserl, Heidegger, existential phenomenology in the sense. And of course, Merleau-Ponty in terms of looking at the embodied process. So, I think these are sort of the two main big schools that influence a lot of these thinking. And we can't, of course, forget the impact of people like Martin Buber, his philosophy of relationship, dialogue, or even, if we go more contemporary, actually, people like Kurt Lewin, and what he sort of developed in terms of field theory, because field theory is still quite a major tenet of Gestalt practice. And I think all of those sort of come about, and some of them have got tension. Some of these ideas got tension between them, but that's the sort of the pleasure, I think, to sort of really get below the superficial surface of what Gestalt provides and really see that it's quite rich in terms of philosophical input.
Mm.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, in the book, there are a number of sort of unusual concepts like will and grace, and there's a lot of exercises about sort of sensing and awareness, which wouldn't be out of place in a book on sort of personal development or spirituality. You mentioned Buber, and he plays quite a large part in the book.
Absolutely.
But I wondered how those approaches go down in the, I think you sort of quote here, in the sort of in the harsher and less relationally focused reality of organizational life. In the hard world of organizations, how do these spiritual
Absolutely
approaches
they do stand out, and I guess I make no excuses for that, because how ROG is different is that to become a ROG practitioner is primarily about developing your personal awareness. So it is about your personal development. And without that, it's almost impossible to lean into a core way of working in a Gestalt way, which is the use of self as an instrument. And in doing that, sometimes you're absolutely right, and I think I do notice the tension there, that doing that in really harsh organizational environments is difficult. And what this book is not saying is that some of these concepts need to be used as is in a context that isn't receptive, perhaps, or ready for that sort of challenge. A key aspect of organizational Gestalt and relational organizational Gestalt is to meet the client where they are, to understand the world from their perspective. So, if we believe that as human beings, we're primarily relational and we're at our best when we are in a supportive relational context, then we can then understand that usually harsher or less relational contexts are those where perhaps fear dominates and people protect themselves through some of these power plays. And through the illusion that they can perhaps leave aspects of themselves at the door when they come to work. And I guess what ROG does is challenges that in a gentle way. So I would say, if I'm a ROG practitioner, I need to develop my personal awareness, my understanding of myself to be more effective, and then bring my clients along with me at the pace that they can manage or understand. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yes. It sounds a more human approach.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. In a way, it's about saying, well, you know, if the organizational context is steeped in, you know, in a harsh interaction or a lot of fear,
Yeah.
as a practitioner, I'd stop and say, you know, I need to be interested in finding out what is stopping people being more authentic and bringing all of themselves, you know, be it their emotion or spirituality or you know, just their more authentic selves in that work context. And so in doing that and being curious about that is to start uncovering aspects of probably the underlying dynamics at play that is making that context less safe.
Because you mentioned fear, and I mean, one of my favorite chapters is your chapter on dialogue.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of sort of, you talk about emergence, you talk about will and grace, and I can imagine sort of leaders, if you like, sort of section leaders or CEOs or something, being, particularly if they were brought up in a more traditional scientific management sort of school, being afraid of the uncertainty of going into the liminal space, as it were. How do you overcome their fear? You know, because I can see a lot of them would probably want to run back to the safety of a nice protocol-driven sort of will-based, I-it-based sort of paradigm. But how do you overcome their fear?
Yeah, well, first, I'm glad you like the chapter, because it probably, in terms of writing the book and sort of unpacking some concept, that's also one of my favorite chapters. And because it started to get me to reflect on how different types of dialogue existed in groups. And I didn't just want to place, you know, the Buberian sort of I-thou type dialogue as, you know, the target for groups, because it didn't feel very authentic. You know, it's not always the reality of organizations. But at the same time, I believe that most people, if you had the one-to-one conversation with them, would have had an experience of being in a group that works really well, be it at work or outside of work. And so they know the power of a grace-based experience, of having that type of togetherness that feels effortless, emergent, as well as very effective. So yes, you're right, it is a scary concept to ask, you know, a lot of managers to move away from their safe, you know, often will-based way of communicating. And again, you know, as a ROG practitioner, I need to meet the client where they are. I wouldn't, for example, certainly place that top right grace-based sort of quadrant as a target of how groups always needed to interact or the target to reach for a group. But I think that even in a group that manages dynamic and co-emergent dialogue, they will at times need to interact differently in a more will-based or I-it approach. And that will be totally appropriate. So I guess I don't see that as a one place to reach, but more of different, the quadrants need to be touched upon at the various times. And also knowing that there is a grace and an I-thou place to reach, or that could be of use, is also very inspiring. So it's not about saying, well, actually you're here and you need to get here. It's like, okay, so what's happening now? What's stopping you interacting that way? What's missing from this group is how I see this framework, and this framework has been used really. So I would, as a ROG practitioner, I would heighten awareness of where a group is mostly operating and whether there's an appetite for more. And if not, why not? You know, what's stopping that appetite, or do they even need it? So really, it is very much a co-emergent approach rather than this is a right way of operating. Does that, make sense? Yeah.
Thank you. One of the ways I can see that, or one of the factors that might be difficult to deal with, is sort of individual ambition and the sort of Machiavellian office politics that go on. One of the central concepts of the book is the SOS, the self-other situation. But I wondered how you deal with issues of power and ambition and sort of individuals who are wanting to promote themselves over the organisation, if you know what I mean.
Yes, yes, it's a nice question. You know, I think you mentioned the SOS model, and of course it is inspired from an individual model of self, and power dynamics found in groups and organizations need to, of course, to be taken into account. I think the ROG approach doesn't dispute the fact that in organizations, you know, a top-down or preset strategic goals are common, and even at times a necessity. What is emphasized for me is that this is done in awareness of the impact and tensions between, you know, an individual's sort of need and the process, so the task and the process. So a ROG practitioner will name the power dynamics in the room and the impact it's having. And so that's why it's quite a demand to actually say, well, to a leader, for example, you've just made that sort of intervention, and can you notice that when you've said that, everyone's become silent in the room and you haven't had the responsiveness. So there is something about sort of naming the power dynamic in the room and raising awareness around that. And I think you're right that sometimes in some contexts, people are not open to listening to that message, and it's not safe enough to be fully yourself or authentic. So authenticity isn't always rewarded. And it's important, I think, as we look at the ROG approach, to always recognize that for probably individuals need to know when this is not safe enough and to protect themselves, because authenticity, although is good, I think also leaves people quite vulnerable. So not all individual needs can be met in a given organizational context, and often the context needs to be worked on and changed before people can feel safe. And as you probably know, in teaching ROG, and especially the SOS model, we often also talk of the need to take the ecological turn, which starts with the situation, in order to enable the self to flourish. So often it's, you know, how can we start looking at the situation, what is making the situation unsafe, what are the power dynamics that happen there, before asking people to, you know, become more open and vulnerable in their sort of self-other relating, or in fact open themselves up as individuals. I don't know if that answers somewhat your question. I think the issue of power is a complex one.
Yes, yes, no, that answers it very well. Yes, in other words, you sort of out what's happening in the room, the dynamics in the room, and
yes,
and say
yes, yes, and of course it's not always easy, because, you know, often if you're there, then you're probably there at the invitation of the most powerful person in the room, and so you need to manage that dynamic and that relationship. So that brings me back to a key aspect of ROG, which is how do we contract relationally, and how do we make that an iterative contract, so that we always sort of review what's been happening, and, you know, and also almost sort of tell our clients, this is not just going to be, you know, implementing what you want to happen, but this is also going to be challenging to you. And that sort of authenticity is quite important. Yeah.
And finally, what would you hope will be the legacy of the book, the effect on both sort of individual organizations, but also on the culture as a whole, on sort of Western culture?
Yeah. Well, it's a sort of a big question, but I guess if I start at an organizational level first, I'd say mostly that it could support organizational practitioners, be it OD consultant, managers, coaches, etc., in staying with emergent and relational approaches as a way of addressing some of the complexities and uncertainty of organizational life. Because I think more than ever, and that goes beyond the organizations today, we face complex solutions, complex problems where the solutions aren't that obvious. And that's true in organizations, but particularly in societies and the world overall. I mean, I'm speaking to you here from the Middle East, where it's never, you know, more true than here. And I don't think that we can simply think ourselves out of these problems and issues. So, you know, however clever we are, the solution needs for us to know how to be with each other. So it asks us to recognize our fundamental interconnectedness and the responsibility that it places on each one of us. So we can't act anymore as disconnected individuals or community, but we have to realize that a future that is ethical is based on absolutely our ability to collaborate and compromise. So my hope is that ROG started a bit of that, and gives a little hope of how this also can be achieved. So a big want, if you like, but hopefully doable in small chunks.
Excellent. Thank you, Marianne. I very much enjoyed our conversation, and thank you.
I've enjoyed our conversation too, and I'm sure more to follow. Thanks a lot, Jim. Thank you.